So we're on this journey together, following resources called Practicing the Way, where we're implementing practices, the kind of life that Jesus modelled for us here on earth, learning from him how to live our whole lives, becoming his apprentices, participating in the transformation, sanctification and salvation that God has given us, and living as his body on the earth. We're learning to obey everything that Jesus taught and commanded and invited us into. These aren't formulas to adhere to, but invitation into a tailor-made rhythm for us and our families to live our lives with God, doing things his way, which is ultimately the absolute best way for us. So today, we're going to start by looking at desire. The spiritual journey begins with desire, with wanting to follow Jesus and be transformed into a new kind of person. Desire is the engine of our life, the drive to get out of bed in the morning and live. But when you pay close attention to the inner dynamics of your heart, you realize that desire is never satisfied. 1,000 years before Christ, the writer of Ecclesiastes said, "The eye is not satisfied with seeing." Or a more recent philosopher just said, "I can't get no satisfaction." No matter how much we get, it's never enough. Thomas Aquinas, the medieval intellectual, once asked the question, what would it take to satisfy human desire? The answer he came up with was everything. We would have to experience everything and everyone and be experienced by everything and everyone to feel satisfied. We would have to be infinite. But we're not. We're finite and we have limits. So all of us live with chronically unsatisfied desires. The word used by the Bible authors to name this inner disquiet is restlessness. This is an ancient problem rooted in human nature, but it's been manipulated by the culture of consumerism in the West, and in particular by advertising, which is basically an attempt to monetize our restlessness. We see upwards of 4,000 ads per day, all of which are intentionally designed to leave us feeling unsatisfied. And it works. We fall for the old carrot on the stick routine, chasing more money, more clothes, more things, more experiences, more relationships, more and more, but it's never enough. Rest is always just out of reach. So, is there a way to fight against the restlessness of the human heart and the age to which we belong? You guessed it, yes, Sabbath. Sabbath is a practice from the way of Jesus by which we war against the cancerous restlessness of our age, and instead we take on the easy yoke of our Rabbi Jesus to find rest for our souls. The Sabbath practice that we're looking at is split into 4 movements: stop, rest, delight, and worship. A fortnight ago we looked at stop, and what a beautiful moment we've had today so far of just stopping before him. And this week we're going to look at rest. So let's go to Genesis 2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. Now, when we hear the word rest, we may think of sleep, or maybe a little margin, a day off, a few hours of quiet, or just some time to relax. But the idea behind Shabbat is far more. It's holistic rest, or what Jesus called rest for your souls, for your whole person. On the Sabbath, we rest from work, all work, not just paid work, not just our jobs, but all work, including chores and errands and to-do lists. We rest from working, but it's more. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his book, The Sabbath, says we rest not just from work, but even thinking about work. See, neuroscientists tell us that even when we think about work, even if we're at home resting, it secretes the same stress chemicals in our brain as if we were working at the office or in the actual situation. So we rest from even the thought of working, but it's still more. We rest from wanting and worrying. To further this idea, we're going to look at Deuteronomy 5. The Ten Commandments are recorded twice in the Torah. The first is in Exodus 20, which we looked at the other week, when Israel is at the foot of Mount Sinai, right after leaving Egypt. The second is in Deuteronomy 5, on the edge of the Jordan, right before entering the Promised Land. There are 40 years between, which means Deuteronomy 5 is to the next generation, who were still unborn or children at Mount Sinai. And the Sabbath command is similar, but a little bit different. It says, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." There are two differences between the Sabbath command in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5. The first is minor. In Exodus, it's remember the Sabbath. But here, it's observe the Sabbath. In Hebrew, the word is shema, and it means to keep watch over, to guard. Think of how we observe a holiday or a holy day, such as Christmas or Easter. We guard it. We make it special and unique. And that's the idea. Sabbath is like a weekly holiday. We are to keep over it, lest it just becomes another ordinary day. This is why in the Kiddush, which is the ancient Jewish liturgy to begin the Sabbath, you light not one but 2 candles to symbolize the 2 commands: remember the Sabbath and observe the Sabbath. That's the first change. The rest of the command is verbatim until the very end, where there's a major change. In Exodus it reads, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." But as we've just read in Deuteronomy, it says, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm." Same command, but a whole other rationale behind the command. In Exodus, the rationale is grounded in the story of creation, for in 6 days, etc. Here, in Deuteronomy, it's grounded in the story of liberation. You were slaves in Egypt, but you're not slaves anymore. At Sinai, Sabbath is about rhythm. In Deuteronomy, it's about resistance. The last movement of the Sabbath we looked at was all about rhythm, and this movement is about resistance. In the Exodus story, there's all sorts of language about restlessness. For example, here's some snippets from Exodus 3. "Why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work. Make the work harder so that they keep working." Pharaoh said, "Lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks. See, in the story, Pharaoh is a cruel tyrant. No matter how hard the Hebrews worked, it was never enough. They lived under the oppressive yoke of the daily quota, more, more, and more. And it wasn't just Pharaoh. It was the socio-economic system of Egypt as a whole. Israel was making bricks to build supply cities, entire cities just to store all of Pharaoh's extra stuff. And it was an economic system built on the back of slavery. To get the lavish, opulent lifestyle of a Pharaoh or of Egypt, you need cheap labor to work while you rest. And slaves don't get a Sabbath. Slaves are subhuman, a commodity to buy and sell. They only have value in what they produce. They work all day, every day, until they die. Rest is what comes when you are set free by God. So the command is to remember you're not slaves anymore. You're in a new kingdom, under a new king. There is no daily quota, no taskmaster over your head. And, this is very key, remember to never become a slave driver yourself. Hence the command about your male and female servants, the foreigner, even your animals, all are equal under the Sabbath. All rest. And we need this practice now more than ever because Pharaoh and Egypt are both alive and well. In the literary design of the Bible, Egypt is an archetype, similar to Babylon later on. It was a real empire, but it's symbolic of all empires down through time. We see similar patterns in our moment in history, where a tiny percentage at the top control the majority of the world's wealth, whilst billions of people find themselves at the bottom who control very little of the world's wealth. Egypt is horrible if you're a slave, but it's not half bad if you're an Egyptian. There are billions of people in our world who work hard every day to make our clothes and our shoes and our phones. We think of slavery as a tragedy from the past, but social activists tell us there are upwards of 40 million slaves in the world today, most of them women and children. The point is simply that Egypt isn't just a historical nation state. It's a running theme through the library of Scripture for a culture of restlessness, of which there are many, many examples down through history and around the world today. A culture of unchecked desire for more. Here in the West, we work more than ever before. In the 1960s, with the rise of so-called labour-saving devices, such as dishwashers and central heating and computers, futurists predicted that within a few decades, we'd all be working no more than 20 or 30 hours a week and living in leisure. Yet leisure time is down 37% since the 60s. And as a culture, we have more than ever before. Conservative estimates say that we now spend 2 to 10 times more on goods and services than those in 1945. And our homes are full of more than twice as many things. Meanwhile, many people all around us are barely able to put food on the table. But in spite of that, we're unhappier than ever before. Sociologists tell us that happiness levels in the West hit a peak in the 1950s and have been in decline ever since. And it's no coincidence that in this time we have seen the relaxation of Sunday trading laws and a cultural departure from keeping Sunday special to watch over it. To sum up, we work more than ever before, we have more than ever before, and we're still not happy. It's Egypt all over again. And it's so easy to get sucked into this culture, to feel like you just have to work those extra hours to get ahead. Like you have to reach a standard of living to be happy. You just have to have this many shoes and that many outfits. You just have to participate in this part of the economy, even though it does great harm to the earth or the poor. It's so easy to say, well, it's just how it is. But it doesn't have to be this way. Rest is an act of resistance. It's an act of defiance against Pharaoh and his empire. It's a way of saying with our bodies, enough. Enough work. Work is a good thing, but it's not the thing. Enough stuff. Stuff isn't bad, but most of us have more than enough. Sabbath is a way to break our addiction to the twin gods of the West, accomplishment and accumulation. These aren't in themselves evil. They can even be good, but there's a limit. And at some point, you need a line in the sand to say, this far you shall go, but no further. I do not need to work more hours. I do not need to make more money. I do not need the perfect grade or the perfect body or the perfect house. I do not need to earn my human father's approval. I already have it from my heavenly Father. Pharaoh and his army are at the bottom of the Red Sea. I am free. I have all I need to thrive with God in his world. And I'm in a new kingdom now with a new king. Of course, this all sounds great, but my point is Sabbath is an act of resistance, a line of war. Which means when we practice Sabbath, we will feel resistance. This can be external resistance. The culture all around us is a Sabbathless, rhythmless, hollow out your soul culture. To Sabbath well will require intentionality, preparation, and a resolute determination to go against the flow of the cultural tide, to live differently. This is not easy, but you are standing against what the Apostle Paul calls the principalities and the powers in Ephesians. The theologian Walter Wink defines the powers as both heavenly and earthly, divine and human, spiritual and political, invisible and visible. They are the meta forces that keep us from Sabbath rest. Systemic racism, sexism, greed, political corruption. All of these forces are animated by dark powers that are all anti-Sabbath. Through Sabbath, we defy these powers and align ourselves with the God of Sabbath, of rest. But there's also an internal resistance. Egypt isn't just around us, it's in us. To Sabbath, to rest, we have to resist the internal dynamics of restlessness within us, greed, envy, discontentment, anxiety, addiction, etc. With all the practices, and frankly with God himself, we feel what Ruth Haley Barton calls the push-pull dynamic. There's a tug of war inside us. We feel the pull towards Jesus and his way, a genuine desire to be with him and find rest for our souls. But we also feel the push away from Jesus and his way, a resistance or reluctance to give up our autonomy and self-will and surrender to him. In the practice of Sabbath, we will feel this push-pull dynamic at work in our own bodies. I certainly know that feeling. It turns out that I am absolutely shocking at resting. I am good at collapsing from exhaustion, but resting, oh boy, have I got a way to go. But what a gift Sabbath has been. When we Sabbath, when we stop and rest, a revealing of what's going on inside us takes place. This can be really difficult, which is why we need community around us to share with, and who can help us and journey through it with us. Had Kath and I not decided to implement Sabbath, I imagine my restlessness, which is actually somewhat normalized by the world around us, would have rumbled under the surface for years and years till something major will have cracked in me. And don't we see that time and time again in the world around us? Emotional breakdowns, marriages ending, mental health crises. And where do people turn? Drugs, alcohol, sex, violence, numbing agents to mask the internal struggle and pain because the world has decided there's no hope. But we have hope, and his name is Jesus. God gave himself freely to us and offers us the choice to partake in his life, in his way, his rhythm, and the easy yoke. If we give ourselves intentionally to this, we will become a people who don't just regurgitate right answers, but who become a people of love, who have hope, who rest well, and delight in our Creator. So, Sabbath rest is our secret weapon in the struggle against the powers of the age. An entire day to have enough. In those push-pull moments when we have to resist both the external and internal forces that are anti-Sabbath, remember, we are not slaves anymore. God is king, but he's nothing like Pharaoh. He is a Sabbath-keeping, Sabbath-commanding God. Jesus calls himself the Lord of the Sabbath, and he's offering you rest for your souls. So the question is, will you resist?